PR permission.
There we go. All right, everybody. Be on
Carol, recording.
Yeah.
So I think we're still missing a couple people.
Yeah, I'm
I don't think-
chasing.
Caroline and Stian, and I know Daniel had a last minute redirect, so he won't be here. Uwe, I think, is still coming. Martina's here. That's important. Hello, Martina.
Hello, Shelley. I just dropped out of another meeting, so it's good to have a couple of minutes to just refocus.
So Martina, hopefully you saw in the agenda that I am going to ask you to talk about your use case. You'll have a little bit of time to prepare, but I know you already have slides because I've seen them. So I figured it wasn't going to be too bad to ask you to do it.
Actually, Shelley gave me a hands-on, and I haven't looked at the agenda, I have to admit. So.
No worries.
Oh, the agenda. Let me find that link.
The agenda only became available yesterday, so sorry I was behind.
And I only
Getting
remembered
it to
to send it
everybody.
late last night, which could have been people's early mornings. I'm not sure which. A little bit of a miracle that I remembered it all. Oh, thanks, Carol. Yay.
That's all right. I was sending it to Stian to say, where the heck are you?
Reposting. Huh.
So
Edit.
the
Okay.
plan really is that the majority of this meeting is discussion, and that there's very little presentation. I was going to do a slight amount of orientation, have Martina talk about her use case, and then basically we drop into a semi-structured discussion to start to talk about how we approach this. And we know Carol's got to leave by 45 minutes after.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm speaking plenary, keynotes, and panels in 2 different conferences on 2 different disciplines in the same afternoon. My head is a bit mashed.
No worries, Carol. I think, none of this can be done quickly. This is all a stepwise process, and missing any one meeting is not going to kill anybody, I'm pretty sure.
No, that's all right. Okay, good.
Caroline is coming in.
Yeah.
And oh, here comes James. All right. Yep. Good. And oh, it is 5 minutes after.
Yeah, I think we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay.
All right. So welcome, everybody. I don't think I have to do introductions around. Would people prefer that we do? I think everybody mostly knows each other. So James, I don't know that. Do you know everybody?
Not personally. I've known everyone through the last few meetings.
Okay, all right. I think that's as good as we can hope for. Personally, feels like it's been 10 years since I've met anybody personally at this point. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and throw up a presentation. If I can remember how to do that. God, you'd think that would be just second nature at this point on Zoom. Okay, so welcome to our 3rd meeting, though it's not the large group meeting anymore. This is just a subgroup. And really the idea of this meeting is to spend time talking among ourselves about what makes sense as a solution. So the goals for today's meeting, Martin had a great point. Let's try as hard as we can to start simple. The way I would like to, what I'm proposing, how we approach this is that we identify one or more proposed solutions that might be viable. We talk about the viability of these solutions, but then to assess the viability, we actually look to build example implementations of those proposed solutions so that we can understand the gaps, so that we can evaluate those against some evaluation criteria. And that we probably look at having some specific use cases that we want to demonstrate that particular solution with those use cases and what it would look like, right? So that we have a real feel for, you know, so then the next meeting would be where we would then talk through those potential implementations. So the way I wanted to structure today is, I guess I think of this reliquary as having sort of the framework, the outer container that sort of defines the reliquary. And then there's the definition of the objects inside the reliquary. And so I wanted to sort of frame it as, let's start by talking about the container. And then let's start talking about the objects inside that container and what they look like. Is that okay with everybody? Any feedback on that sort of a proposal? All right, I'm getting a few nods. All right. So the agenda for today, I just did the goals and process part. I'm going to turn it over to Martina to talk about an additional use case that beyond the ones that we've heard so far. And then we're going to just drop into that framework, then objects. Then the third piece of that discussion will be about how and where would these things happen, right? You know, if once we've talked through what do these look like, then how do they happen? And then I'll bring it back to next steps. All right, so I'm going to quit mine, and Martina, I'm going to turn it over to you. Hopefully you've had enough time to decompress a little and be ready to do this.
Yeah, I think I did. I hopefully be able to share the screen as well. So I hope you can see the screen okay.
Yep, looks great.
Okay, I will be brief. So Shelley put me on the spot last time and I was not really prepared to present our use case. So I got back and thought a bit more and made this one slide to just display what we are doing. So it's basically a model intercomparison study as we have it in the current IPCC climate report, or what our plans are. So the situation is we have a lot of model data. We assign, or we have DOIs and citation possibilities on the whole model result. So all data which is created in a model run or even for a model experiment gets one citation possibility. Within that, we can identify individual data sets via PIDs, but we do not have any authors attached to that. And a usual intercomparison study just selects very few data sets over a range of different models and model experiments. And that is more or less the input data, so the data from others, which is referenced in the study. So you could say it's an input data reliquary in that sense. And then there is the study itself, and that creates scripts and creates data. We call it final data. So you could make another reliquary of these final data. Actually, I would not mix up input data and final data because, well, one is a reference of things you use and the second is what you produce. But I guess there are different use cases and you can do it differently. There's just one point I want to mention. And that is that the model result itself is the result of a similar process, more or less. So you have input data sets coming from different expert groups, which go into that model run. You have different model components. You have post and pre-processing to just bring the input data into the format that you can use in the model run, and afterwards you have a post-processing to comply to the standards for the project. So there's a whole chain there as well. And the reason is for the granularity of this model data DOI is mainly because of practicability. So the input data applies to the whole model run, and so to all data sets. It's just making things a bit too complicated to just say, well, it's attached to every data set which is produced or created in the model run. And the most important thing is, for the data creators, it's more interesting to see where the model experiment was used than to know where one individual data set was used. So it makes more sense to have these aggregated level for the statistics of usage of the data in literature. The other part for the data sets is more interesting for the project management. So the next data request might be different if some of the data sets are never used. So, well, it's a different use case, but for citation, we have these aggregated level for citation of model data. Yeah, and that's more or less what I wanted to say. Maybe just mentioning that apart from models, sometimes in the studies, you have also observational data for evaluation of the results. So different kind of data.
Okay. Thanks so much. Or did you have a second slide that you wanted to present?
This is the second one.
Okay. They look enough alike. Okay. So as you'll see in the notes, I did put down some thoughts about some of the topics for each of these segments of the discussion. So there is some thought about some potential organization of this, but I think what I mostly want to do is open it up. The gauntlet that's been thrown down at the beginning or at the end of last meeting, or toward the end of last meeting, was really by Martin, which was that a collection might be the simplest way to sort of do these reliquaries. Martin, you're giving a face like, no, I didn't.
Well, I'm not sure that I came up with the idea that the collection is the thing that best sort of describes the reliquary or makes it actionable, let's say. This is something that, of course, works with dataset to DOIs. I don't know, is collection also constantly used in biostudies? Is that sort of basically the same, just using different identifiers, etc.?
Well, it depends on collection in which sense, right? So we don't. So biostudies has sort of its own model in a way, right? So yes, collection of links to other objects. We have that. We don't call it collection. It's not very helpful. I understand.
So are you proposing that it's kind of just a bag of things, Martin? Because I think we've all got things that bags of things.
Yeah,
Is that
most of us are in the container, crate, and bag business.
Yeah, is it all the same?
Well, in data sets specifically, and I think I said this the last time, collection is a generic term, whereas if you have 1,000 data sets and you want to group them together, data set would also call them data set, because the slicing the data sets is so arbitrary And collection is really, oh, there's data sets and software and whatever. But maybe that's too granular for this discussion.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think
the language
collection, I think,
already-
is like what museums use, right? So I have to be careful there.
Sorry?
I guess this is why we end up with that term reliquary, because collection is
exactly.
like a collection of specimens and so on, right?
If we get stuck in these different terms and where they're still are different, I think we can just spend the whole call and not make much progress.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the granules are, the definition of the granules are the very root of some of the challenge, in that you may have a data set DOI that has 100,000 granules underneath it, and your reliquary may only want to cite 5,000 of those 100,000 granules, which means, and those granules may have a different type of PID to the DOI assigned to it, because it's not feasible to put 100,000 DOIs on the granules underneath the DOI. So I think the challenge, and I think the reason we keep coming back to this is because it's very much the granules problem. And that's the bit I struggle with, because we're trying to figure out how to do this as a data center. We have data sets, we have a data collection, which has 130, 140,000 granules in it now. And it's just not feasible or practical to put DOIs in every single granule. So, and yet we need to be able to cite or include citations of subsets of that large collection within papers.
So I have a thought. Well, actually, we confabbed yesterday, and we kind of came up with a potential thought on this. What if it was so easy to make one of these things that, in fact, anyone could make one and define exactly what was inside this particular identifier reliquary thing, such that it was exact about what this particular paper or other research work was in fact using.
That's
right?
great.
Today, it's so hard to make these things that we have to make them big and then have people use pieces. One of the ways to think about making this problem simpler is if, in fact, it became so easy to make these that anyone could make them for any reason.
And that will solve your slicing problem, because that's just a divide one that has less in it, right?
Right.
Yeah, it needs to be an API we can just poll with the PIDs, and it gives us our PID back that then becomes a citable entity.
Yeah, of course you could give derivation. I came from this other one over there as well, right?
Yeah, I think the relationships need storing elsewhere. I think that then comes down to the specialist and PID graphs when it comes to trying to unravel the knots and the details as to how you get back and enable reproducible research. I think that's a secondary topic, which I think is probably beyond the scope of what we can tackle here and now. I think the key thing we need now is to how do we enable that citation?
Something that's relevant, but might be out of scope for the beginning because it makes our lives even harder, is dynamic data citation. So when you don't have 100,000 granules like in your case, but 10 million, and everybody sort of slices it slightly differently. And then I like the RDI recommendation. The only way you can do this is sort of generate identifier the moment somebody cites the data, not the moment data is generated. But this is I think conceptually it's very clear, but to implement it is not trivial. So I don't know whether we just leave that out and focus on, let's say, a predefined collection with X number of things that don't change every hour or every month or whatever. I don't know. I mean, depends on what communities are wanting to do them, because dynamic data is very common in some and not so important in others.
To do that, you need some kind of semantic where you can add to or remove to something, right? Or have a kind of nested grouping, right? So you can include in many different pages in a sense, right? But then, so you don't have to repeat everything, but maybe easier to just say, here's my list. and it came from over there, and someone else just duplicates that list, that's normally not a problem. Only when you reach those big numbers you're talking about there, would that be a problem? Is that big numbers we want to reach to the depth, like millions? I mean, millions, not a big number really. I mean, if it's, I mean, this megapixel display in front of me now, it fits on the screen with 1 pixel each, right?
Well, and the idea of the reliquary is it's not contained in the paper itself. You know, its definition isn't, so it's not limited by those page limits or character limits or any of those things. And as a digital object, I don't know why there's a specific limit on it other than usability in the first place. So a thought about the dynamic data citations, I guess I've had two thoughts, because in the reliquary, I think of it as not necessarily living within any particular repository. And so, you know, the current dynamic data citation really largely works well because it's inside of the repository where that query resolves. And when I think about if I were to try to make that object portable, my first guess as to how you would do that might be that you'd take the query and you'd take what it resolved to at the time that query was made, or, you know, for that particular publication. If you took all those things out and enumerated them inside of a reliquary, it feels like that might be a reasonable way to actually have a external version of that dynamic data citation, so that somebody could go back with a query, but they also can see what it resolved to explicitly for that particular paper or for that particular time when this was in use.
I'd like that. I mean, to me, make it sounds just like we do workflows, really, right? Because we have a capture of a workflow which could be run, and here's how I run it. But you can run it tomorrow and get something slightly different, right? So that's part of the history of it, but also reproducibility of it, right? Reusability of the reliquary. So they're not static, because then you can run it again next month and get more data, right?
I think there's an element of pragmatism here too, because with dynamic data and any collection that evolves with time and you do updates to it, it's going to change. And I think initially groups aren't going to have the ability to do fully reproducible queries, which is going to create a brittleness in the system. I've discussed this with Martin before in slightly different contexts. And I think initially we may end up with an element of brittleness in there, but as communities and technologies evolve, that brittleness will reduce with time. But I think we may need to accept there may be some brittleness in resolving that fully reproducible collection initially.
I remember when the RDA recommendations in dynamic data citation were sort of finalized, that, for example, Andreas Rauber, one of the co-chairs, was very vocal on basically using the model of database queries. And sort of the idea, for example, many databases just are file-based and they work very differently. And the idea that you just have a collection of files that are the result of a query and then you store them separately, that was sort of, he didn't like that very much. And I can see sort of in the pureness of a concept where everything is sort of defined by a query, that makes sense. But I also don't see that this is pragmatic. And just for the simple reason that things move around, they don't stay in one database. So
yeah, I was about to make the same point, Martin, because I had lots of arguments with him as well about that, because he wanted everybody to just put everything in a database and then everything would be all right.
Yeah, and I think that's the view of the world where it probably gets very far, but it's a certain view of the world.
So I'm all for actually expecting brittleness, actually, because I mean, you know, to draw an analogy, I worked for a long time before Stian was out of school on hypermedia systems, And the reason why they didn't succeed and the web did is because the web was simple and brittle. It would break, but then you would just fix it. Whereas all the other systems said everything has to be perfect for everything to work, and all the links must be accurate and always there. And it has to be a closed system. So I think we have to have a mantra of it has to be open, and we have to expect it to break, in which case you will fix it. We should be webby.
That's good, yeah. Because it would have worked at one time when it was made, right? And that's, in a sense, is good enough for, in the sense of saying where it came from, and it's even better if it still works, right?
Yeah, and also if there's an assumption, if everybody would just do X, Y, and Z, then we would live in a perfect world. I think that argument has been used before, and that sort of can keep you stuck for years. So the just good enough and brittle makes sense to me, because everything is better than what we have now. We don't have to aim for something that solves it once and for all.
So should we have should we be Moscowing this somehow? I'm trying to get a grip of, because we're throwing out sort of features, aren't we here? If we were should we be putting up our features that we expect that you might have as user stories as opposed to use cases, and saying what must, should, could, and won't be done, which is Moscow.
I didn't know that. That's a nice one.
It's a standard software engineering technique.
Also lowercase.
Yeah. So because then you can sort of shift out to say, it absolutely must. I'm not sure what we should absolutely must do yet. I've heard quite a lot of shoulds and maybe a couple of won'ts, but I haven't heard of any musts at the moment. So if you're going to engineer something, you need to have a feature list with a prioritization of the features before you can begin to engineer it.
But I think the simple starting point with reliquaries is that we must be able to describe connections between many data sets where the number n is far higher than someone would ever really want to put in a publication, and link them all in the paper. That this is sort of exploring reference lists, so we need another place to track these references or these connections. That I thought that was a starting point there. In different words from you, but
okay.
So one of the things I'm proposing, in thinking about simple, one of the thoughts of starting simple was if the reliquaries were so easy to make, that in fact I could just narrow down the set that was in another reliquary or somewhere else to exactly what I used. It reduces the indexing problem, because now the indexer only has to do a pass through the references and be able to recognize that this happens to be a reliquary and needs one level of introspection, but not go back to the paper and figure out exactly what things had been referenced inside the reliquary. And so that felt like an easier thing. And I think, Martin, you'd kind of proposed that, or at least you kind of got us thinking about that as a way to maybe do this, because you're right. My original proposal was you have to be able to reference the individual items and then get what was referenced counted. And in that, getting my head around how do you actually make that work with the indexers, with the reference section, with the citations, all those pieces as a full cycle, felt like that might be too big a lift on the first try. And so it felt like if we can create something where you don't care, that a reference for the reliquary should just turn into a citation for each of those things inside that particular reliquary. And you don't have to go back to the paper text to find which of those individual items were cited. You get to assume that they were all cited. That starts to feel like something that could work without a massive lift to make it happen. And that part of the question is, if that were the style of the first version of these reliquaries, would it meet enough of the use cases to be interesting? You know, I mean, can we hit like 80% of the use cases that way? If that's the case, then it's a pretty darn good solution.
That's all pretty straightforward, except the thing about the citation being counted, because the question is who is doing that counting. Well, we can do all the other things, right? But that counting is normally done by, you know, Root, Thompson, all these big things standing behind big brick walls, which we cannot really change practices of. So do we need our own indexing, or how do we just get that bootstrapped? Is it sufficient, so to sneak it into DataCite as a collection, like Martin suggested? Can we
I
then
would
get
suggest that something that happened, which is not directly about data, but very relevant, is something called open citations, where Crossref has done a ton of work with its members, that sort of the idea that citations are locked away and you need to pay somebody if you want this. I don't think that's longer true. I mean, there's not really enough infrastructure to do all this, especially the sort of complicated counting that we are asking for here. But I think that indexing is somewhere out of our reach. I think I wouldn't say this anymore. If you take, for example, our research, who do wonderful things with open access, when Microsoft Academic Search decided to shut down at the end of the year a few months ago, I said, okay, then we have to rebuild this until the end of the year, which would probably, it's already pretty ambitious as it is now, but 10 years ago, you wouldn't even think about that. So I would be comfortable saying we build the building blocks, sort of the collection itself, and over time, there will be ways to sort of expose this and count this, etc. I mean, counting citations is, for me, tricky anyway, because it's, well, the biggest challenge right now is to find these things, but at a later stage, you have to think about what does it mean if I count this. If you have a sort of machine-generated data and you can count 1 million citations, what exactly are you saying there? I mean, there are so many open questions. So I think that if you have a larger time window to sort all this out, I would be worried that I need to wait for an indexer that does this, because some of the indexers are commercial entities, they have their own interests, and then there's a risk that this is then locked away and not really fully usable.
So that says, Martin, that the citations must be countable by external counting services that can offer specialist mechanisms. So that's a should, and that's a clear, so I've put in a table just to make me feel as if I'm being an engineer a bit, so that we can begin to say, right, that's a clear requirement now, because if you can't get the citations out, if you can't serve them to an engine that will do it, then that's our problem, right? The counting is somebody else's problem, but our serving the counters, that's our problem.
And I would very much hope this is not serving numbers, but serving actual citations, so that people can do more with this than bean counting.
Yeah, but even if you want to satisfy bean counter, you could do silly things like saying every time you do a reliquary citation, you also do a slicing. So you have a new reliquary for that particular way of using them, which has its own set of citing all of them in the traditional way, and therefore it will be counted if you just look at the regular citation from that reliquary. It's a transitory thing, but transitive thing, right? But it kind of defies the purpose of a reliquary if it always has to be reinstated, even if you mean exactly the same things. But maybe that is the purpose. I don't know. Is it always a kind of instance?
I actually think of it being the purpose, that it does then get counted as all the individual entities inside of it. Because right now, our only method of doing that is within a repository.
And the value added in this process is
Go ahead, Justin. Sorry.
So the value added in this process is in defining the PID graphs and having a specialist who can deliver meaningful metrics from the underlying data.
So Martina, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just to come back to our use case in relation of what you are discussing at the moment. I fully agree you have to, or we have to start simple, but in our use case, I think we would need one step in addition. So what you find in the reliquary are only PIDs and not where the credit should be. So there would be an additional step to connect that to the DUIs. So it wouldn't really, it wouldn't be our use case, but I agree that we have to start somewhere. But just to keep in mind that there might be high volume data cases where it's similar with ours.
So Martina, is it possible when you're building the reliquary to in fact do that additional step of providing the connection back to the correct item to actually credit?
We are just closing the gap, so to say. So there will be an information in the handles which says which DOI is related to it. So to which model run or model data this individual data set belongs.
Yeah, forward.
At the moment, there's a gap.
Yeah, it's good to have both directions there, right?
Yeah. In future, you can just follow the chain.
Yeah, which means you have to allow that little mutability at least, so to add, because one has to come first, right?
So the
It's
mutability.
Also,
sorry.
Just one sentence. It's also a task of the granularity. So you have to, in the finer granularity, you can easily reference to the DUI to which it belongs. In the other direction, it's usually difficult because you lack information. Or at least in our system.
Thanks. Carol?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the properties we need to be careful about is what is mutable and what is immutable. So I think we need to be quite specific when we're doing our sort of feature set, because that will make a big difference into how we handle it. I'm thinking about there was some citation work done life science identifiers. Don't you remember, if you remember that? And it all fell apart a bit because they never really sorted out the mutability immutability problem. So I'm just flagging that. I'm going to have to go, I'm afraid, to if anybody wants to tell me what libraries should be doing for data science, then now's your opportunity, because I'm about to go and sit on a panel with Cliff Lynch on this. Anybody? No? Okay, I'll make it up.
No, we really need them. We need them to be the connection between what the researchers don't know and what the community has already generated. It's a bridge.
I already had that in Shelley, and I'm going to say Shelley Stoll says.
That's fine. That's fine. The number of tire tracks across my face is significant.
They also need to be invited to the table, number one. Don't leave librarians out of the conversation.
Oh, thank you, Caroline.
That's great.
JPL librarian there.
Absolutely. You should be on this panel, Caroline. Do you want to swap over? I can.
Carol, I ran a program called Data Scientist Training for Librarians. But yeah, like what Caroline said, it's important.
Carol, invite me to the next one.
I just got bounced into it. I mean, as you can tell, because I was coming to this meeting, but I got bounced into it because I did somebody a favor, and then they called in the favor. So that's why it is. But these are great, and I shall remember next time and tell them to invite you guys instead.
So Carol, I think the other primary statement is really, we don't have to make data libraries the same as physical libraries, right? I mean, they can actually participate in that data science if you include them, and make it easier. And I think not including them is is basically dooming ourselves to repeating the paper system.
The other thing I want to add, Carol, if you would, is please point out that librarians are very user-focused and customer-focused. And really, that's what we're all about. So anything that can make the life of the user easier is completely in our wheelhouse, whatever it is, whatever package the information comes in, we're ready to help people find it. So I would say that's number one.
Okay. I'm going to start my intervention by telling everybody who briefed me.
I got a link for you, Carol. I got a link for you in the chat. So
Okay.
It's all there.
All right. Thanks,
It's all in a
thanks so
report.
much, Carol.
Okay, I better go do it now. Thanks for the briefing,
Enjoy
guys.
your panel.
Good luck.
Enjoy.
All right. Yugi.
Yeah, so since simplicity was mentioned as a good principle a bit earlier, I'm sort of in the mood of maybe stupid ideas. So, you know, if somebody asks to me to make a reliquary today, so what do I do? Well, maybe I create a text file, paste in 1000 DOIs, put that text file in Zenodo, and then cite the DOI. So that perhaps satisfies, well, I don't know, 60% of the criteria there. So, well, maybe so now I'm hiding under the table. So because that's clearly too simple. But so how maybe that's a starting point.
But if they each had identifiers and we had some way of counting those citations of that and not just a text file, maybe that is the right simple answer.
Yeah, I mean, if the contents of that text file is then properly indexed, so you can do the analytics on top of it. Conceptually,
I think that will be necessary with sort of whatever implementation. So the citation problem, right? But that's sort of a should criteria, right? Yeah. Anyway.
Oh, Uwe, are you leaving us already again?
Yeah, the problem is we have a problem with the Postgres database, and it happened, I think, 2 hours ago. So Pangea is still working somehow, but we don't have any login or whatever. So I might need to go away. So this is also why I'm late.
Oh, I think that's understood by everyone here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us in the midst of this.
I just wanted to report back that I'm still alive and I did not forget.
Well, thank you. So, James, what do you think? You've been impressively silent.
Yeah, I suppose the thing that I would like to, is this indexing issue, is to be able to actually go in and say that this is what is there, whether or not it still exists, is to be able to actually get back. So I think in terms of the I like the Moscow theme in terms of we want to be we have to have this ability to actually find the things. The other thing that I was thinking is there's been lots of talks about DOIs and PIDs, and is it that we only have PIDs? Are we only having digital elements within this reliquary? Or digitally defined, so you know, PID DOI could define a physical object, but are we only having?
No, that's just a simple case, right? I would think it's a simple case. Is if all the data in the reliquary has a PID, then it's easygoing. But I think it should be a second requirement to also be able to cater for those who do not have one, because they will require additional metadata, right? Like just the URL is probably not good enough, and it might not even be a URL, right? It might be something in the shelf somewhere, right?
If we're being brittle, then a URL might suffice. So yeah, it's do we allow URL? Or at what point do we consider the objects that can be put in this crate?
Well,
Right,
that's
and it
not-
seems to,
Is
oh, go ahead, Shelley.
That's not unlike our current situation. So, you know, here we have an author saying to us, you know, what does the citation look like for a data set? And by the way, my data set doesn't have a PID, it has a URL. So pros and cons. Should they cite the URL? Well, we know the downstream services aren't currently set up to actually give automated credit to a URL because the metadata is not there. You can't connect the dots, you can't get to the ORCID, you can't do all of that today. But if they don't put the citation there, then it can't be mined later to figure out what those connections are, should somebody figure out how to do that. So every day, Chris and I have this very same argument. You know, do you make it as perfect as possible for today? Do you also think about tomorrow? And how much work did you just ask your author to do? So I think it's the same answer. Like if the simple solution, we can get all the PIDs in there, the point we're doing this is credit is not working. It's not working. It's not getting down to the elements. So yes, get the PIDs in there. Oh, by the way, I have 3 URLs because that's just how my research went. To be complete, we should figure out how to allow that, but it may not result in credit today, but maybe tomorrow.
The other important part of that, Shelley, is not that I want this to continue, but you know, we're all mining the literature for various things, and context is always important. Some brief amount of context, you know, what we always tell people, like, add some information next to this thing that you're adding, you know, like, because later on, you know, it always happens. We're going to be recurating, you know, like everything. It's never, you know, set in stone. And so like having some context too is also helpful, but.
So, oh, Uwe, did you? Sorry, you don't have quite as much context of what we're talking about.
No, I don't have any context yet. So
let me give you a slight bit of context, and then I'm going to try to summarize where I think we've gotten to now, so that everybody can shoot holes in it. So basically the where we're starting is looking at the framework, and if somebody could paste in, oh, you already pasted in, Shelley, you pasted in the agenda. But we're still talking about what is the framework of this reliquary, right? What is this outer shell, and some of how does it work, right? And we're really aiming for something simple.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm going to try to summarize where we currently are, and I might be not quite as aggressive as Yugi, but in that direction of basically saying, what I think I've heard so far is pretty good agreement to that the reliquary could be a list of collection of objects. It itself has some identifier, maybe a DOI, and each of the elements in it have identifiers on them. They're the research objects, and that a citation of that reliquary ideally counts, and how what the must part of that is a question, as citations of the individual elements inside of that reliquary, and that ideally there is some amount of ability to provide some context information about what the meaning of that particular object is within this context. The beauty of this sort of a solution, if they're easy to make for anybody, is that you would then have the ability to have that anyone could make one because they have only a subset of some other existing collection or other things, where they could make their own one of these that exactly matches what they wanted to reference. Therefore, it might only ever be cited once, but it'd be exact. And I think, what else have I left out of? Do people agree that that is roughly what we've sort of landed on right now? And you know, a piece of sort of then digging in from there would be to say, okay, does a data site collection enable this? Like, could you just do this if you were able to make collections?
Yeah.
Or, you know, Yugi has gone a little further and said, maybe I just make a text file with the list of all the things and throw it in Zenodo, and this all works. But the reality is we want a structured text file because you want that you're able to index the things in there. And so, but I think it feels like we're hitting on something that is getting somewhat general agreement that if we can just define this thing, that maybe this could be done. And I think some of the question is, are there already existing mechanisms in Zenodo or in DataCite like collections that could already be used to this purpose?
Can I throw out a controversial observation, possibly controversial observation? This sounds an awful lot like what ORCID should be or set out to be, but instead with the emphasis on the collection of documents, materials, publications, instead of on the creator. As in, everyone knows it's a pain in the ass to update your ORCID because you have to do it manually. You have to go, you know, publication by publication by publication. If there was some automated way to do this, you could slap a DOI or some kind of identifier on that collection and say, hi, yeah, this is my collection. I put it together, but you're welcome to bust it apart if you want to use the individual elements. Does that sound like where we want to go?
I have problems with the ORCID example for a slightly different reason, which is ORCID records are very much seen as this is my CV, and we from DataCite have run into problems repeatedly. There are people at Pangea, but also in other places that just have 10,000 or 100,000 data sets with their ORCID attached to it. And ORCID just doesn't take it. And when we tried, it just exploded. I think, Uwe, you also have a few people with tens of thousands of data sets. So yeah, so the ORCID model is really more a showcase and rather than a big soup of stuff that you can sort through in various ways. But that's partly tangential. But if for me, it sounds like if we go back to the musts and shoulds, etc., I think that the very simple concept of collections we have agreed upon, and then there are sort of different levels that maybe it's just a text file, but that's not really ideal. So you use identifiers that have some extra features, or you use more structured file formats and so forth. So I think this sounds very straightforward. Of course, many people are doing this already, so it's not that we came up with this idea today, but
it just needs to be systematic so that you can actually do this on a large scale, right? But Martin, do you think if let's say we just do that, there's a text file in Zenodo, right? So you have a list in there with, I don't know, let's say 1,000 DOIs then, so not like a heads explode. And that's the base case. And programmatically, yes, you can just retrieve that if you recognize it as being the magic thing. Would it make sense to also these be added as relations in the DataCite registration so that it's propagated up as citations? Or would that make other things explode on DataCite side? Assuming we're using Zenodo, which is based on DataCite, right?
Well,
if you go to handle our own thing in the handle system, we can do whatever we want, of course, but let's assume it's DataCite for now.
I think relation and DataCite are sort of a place that has been grown too much. So it's a little bit of a mess because there's, I don't know, 25 relations and some are obvious like versions and part of and citation, but there is, that adds a level of complexity. Is it a citation or is it not? So that's something that's important, but I would also say that's a sort of should layer where in the simplest case, I would just say these 1,000 files are part of this reliquary. That's all I want to know, and I don't need relation types or anything.
I think there's different levels of citation with where we're going. One is direct citations, so someone's directly cited the full collection of data you worked on. I think there's also a level of indirect citations where it's been incorporated in a product which has been cited by, but you don't necessarily know which bit of that product they used.
Stian, for the Zenodo example, you know, my understanding is that anything needs development in Zenodo.
You could prove whatever you want. Yeah,
yeah,
as long as it's not nasty, right?
But I think Invenio RDM is pretty robust and pretty flexible, and you know, that like you know, that can be spun up, and you know, the interface can be fairly simple. You know, if you get out of sort of the Zenodo frame, you know,
But we need to we're finding a method, not a new repository. We don't want to force everyone into one centralized repository necessarily, but we can demonstrate it with one, right? If we can demonstrate it without even modifying a repository, then even better, right?
When we spoke 5 minutes ago, I also thought that the idea of text files with long lists of data sets, I mean, that's also super common in things like Baggett. I mean, this is not I mean, everybody has been doing this forever in all the different ways that people describe this. And of course, research objects you have also, and we haven't focused on the 10,000 links so much, but I think there are many, many different implementations. And I think, especially when you go to PIDs versus URLs or a particular PID, this is super frustrating for researchers if you're not careful. I mean, of course, I would be the last person to say there's no value in PIDs because otherwise things just dissolve. But for this, it has to be a straight story that the basic idea is that you link things together and you care about persistence in some way, because otherwise it's not really reproducible if a year later it doesn't work anymore because all the links are gone or something.
Though, Martin, just to play devil's advocate, I mean, I'm certainly guilty of having referenced URLs in my papers because it was the only thing there was to, you know, where I got that information.
I think you're in good company there.
so, you know, you think about it, and, you know, if we think of the primary use case as being in order to enable citation of, you know, within a body of research work, if we think of it that way as its primary purpose, then the fact that some of these items inside the reliquary are brittle is not always a bad thing, right? Because even being able to know what they did know at the time when they got that could give me the ability to go off and try and deconstruct what was that. Go off to the Internet Archives or somewhere to start to look up what could that have been, versus having nothing there. Because we're always going to have some things we want to reference that don't have a persistent identifier that's long-term.
Yeah, I was involved in a project a long time ago, which was cross-reference, not data. And unfortunately, we didn't finish this, but the idea was once and for all, count how many URLs are reference lists in publications in Crossref, and sort of what are the factors and when are they broken, etc. I mean, there are enough publications to make this clear, in particular Herbert van der Zompel. And I think it's just the fact that these are becoming more common rather than less, and that's because you cite whatever you cite. If it's a WHO report that they just put on their website, and I think that's all fine, but because that's the only way you can do this. But sort of one idea which is built into the dynamic data, in which Crossref is pushing but hasn't really implemented as a system, is the idea to create a persist identifiers when you want to cite rather than when you have something, so that there could be that you take care of building all your reliquaries, but maybe somebody else, and maybe at a later time, and maybe when it's worth it, sort of takes care of making this more persistent in the long run. or you decide that you create lots and lots of reliquaries on a daily basis, and every once in a while you decide that those are really pick up in the community, then you do more to them, and not because if the bar is too high to just start a reliquary for some stuff that nobody cares about later, maybe that's also not good.
Okay, so I want to kind of move us along since we've hit the hour. And before we do that, I want to give everybody a little bit of a break. So how about we take a 5-minute break so everybody can get a bio break, get something to drink or eat or whatever they need, and we'll come back at 7 after.
Okay, so I will leave for now. So maybe I will come a bit later. Or I will watch this, the video.
Right. Yeah, we're recording it, and thank you so much
Okay.
for joining.
Yeah.
We'd love to have you anytime. Okay, so I know we haven't finished this particular topic, but I kind of want to move on to talk about the objects in this reliquary, because we'll come back to talking about how we're going to move forward to sort of narrow this entity down. So in thinking about the objects, we've already started that conversation in that we've talked about different things about those objects. We've talked about them having a PID, maybe a DOI, but some sort of persistent identifier potentially, having potentially metadata about what this thing is or why it's there. Martina talked about just having the identifier. I guess I had been thinking about it is that the enough information to formulate a citation would be there, such that you didn't have to go to another place to find the citation that this identifier should turn into. Are there other thoughts about what should be there for that object within the reliquary? What defines an object in the reliquary?
I mean, something that I find useful is DCAT or also schema docs, so the idea of a data set versus a data download or distribution, which is really focusing more on files and file sizes and checksums and maybe versions, but really more about managing these things rather than who's the author, who's the funder, etc. And one challenge is if you talk 100,000 data sets, maybe they are all the same and there's a lot of repetition and a lot of overhead to create metadata. The balancing act, I think it's different every time, but that sometimes just identifying something where you find it and to make sure you have downloaded it might be all you want. If you say it's part of this bigger thing that describes what the data is about. For me, DOI is a citation identifier. So if you're not planning to cite this specific thing, you don't need a DOI. And if it's just files that are part of something larger, then maybe other identifiers work as well or even better because they're easier to manage because there's less stuff you have to add to.
There has been a concept of a handle where it's not necessarily a globally unique identifier where that handle is just unique within this reliquary.
If we're making a new scheme, why not make it unique to start with?
Yeah, I mean, with UIDs or things like that, it's super cheap to make something unique once and for all. And I have seen it for data sets that often there is sort of a community works not in a single repository, but things are moved around. And so I would agree. CERN actually did exactly that. We were in the grant funded project a few years ago that sort of for identifiers for their files. They looked at handles and DOIs and decided they just use random numbers because that's good enough for them, because CERN, of course, is a community that's very centralized. So everything probably is in one place at the end of the day. But in another project, which was NIH Data Commons, that was an example where files are in multiple places, and it would be a mess if every place had a different identifier, numbering scheme, etc.
While UIDs, which I'm always a proponent for when you don't know better or have just need an identifier, but then there's no registrations on that. You need to add that on, right? And then you have the question of who gets to claim one particular UID. You just have to be first, or hope for the best
But
that
does
no
it
one is
matter?
lying about that identifier and that nothing changes, right?
Yeah, or there's the variation, which, for example, software heritage is sort of pushing in the software source code world, where it's all, I mean, when you do file-based things, you can do hashes as identifiers, which you cannot if there's multiple ways to describe something and where the hash might be different every time, but it's the same content. But sort of for source code, you can compute the identifier or the hash, and then it doesn't really matter who is first or second or where it comes from. But that really requires sort of file binary.
But if it was that flat file of PIDs in it and it was sorted by their, I don't know, their ASCII value, there's only one hash for that, right? You're done.
Yeah. So I guess what I was saying and agreeing with you, it's this can solve some problems, but it's not a panacea for all the identifier problems with lots of files.
Yeah. In fact, that's what we did in our World Cup bingo, right? Because we have this program that generates all these flags, or you're hoping for your team to go out, but it generate a UUID by hashing the names of the countries in alphabetical order, and therefore nobody's cheated and made their own board, right?
Martin, I have another example. Globus. So I think some of the institutional repository, other repositories are sort of trying to wrangle with this big data issue, right? Like and so one thing is they link their repository, the records, right? The DOIs with a Globus link, where the Globus link has all these input files and all these things that Martina is talking about, and Globus does have some, file management system as part of that. But at the end of the day, they have that sort of tombstone record, right? That seems like, another example maybe here that could be useful. But I don't know if I'm going down the wrong path, Martin.
No, that was exactly what I was referring to with the data downloads and hashes and all that Globus has done a lot of in this area, and especially Globus, which is all about moving large files through the world. I mean, they really care about checksums, because otherwise it would be a huge problem when you send gigabyte files around all day and then there's something wrong in the transfer. So that's a very different problem to solve than a citation problem that we are mostly talking about.
Well, there's the citation, right? There's that sort of context, the tombstone, right? Idea, right? You've got some record that has some information about all those sort of files. It's a start. I don't know, like as far as like something simple that we already have, right? And then you sort of go down to that underlying file structure like you're talking about.
So maybe when thinking about reliquaries, maybe one question is, what are the common use cases? Is it more common to have 1 to 5 files attached to some data set, or is the 10,000 really the normal? And is that sort of, because if the reliquary is sort of the one and all, and we invest a lot of time in this, and maybe that makes it very complicated for these small data sets that just has a few files and so forth. So that reliquaries are not a sort of overkill for common problems. And that probably depends on the community. For Martina, probably everything is humongous, so that's fine. But for long tail communities, it might be different.
Ideally, it should be scalable. You should be able to scale it up and down for whatever. I mean, this is just a model. So, I mean, if the ideal format would be, it's for everybody. And it doesn't matter if you have 5 or 10,000 data sets. At least that's an idea that we were kicking around a little while ago.
So Justin's got his hand up.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking through 2 use cases. One is a generic. We have these data sets which are available in these formats, and each granule needs a PID, and you can get that data in several formats. Another one which we're having to work through for a bit at the moment is image data, where image data go on to high performance computing or storage. They are then referenced by annotation software, where those annotations will say it's got this species and it's a seabed type. And that needs to point back to that image forevermore, but the data set that comes from it is a completely different beast, even though it's got to point back. And the bit that's making my head spin a little bit is, what is our minimum metadata spec on the entities that we put within the Reliquary? Don't know if that makes sense to people. I don't have an answer, I'm sorry.
Justin, your example reminds me of IRODS. Maybe people here are familiar with it, but that's used for like sort of that, machine learning, example and annotating, labeling images and other, data for machine learning. And, that's an interesting case to think of, right? Like in this, thinking about machine learning, because that's, course increasing. So.
Yeah, and it's one of these 2 million images from a single data set type situation, and they may have multiple surveys which cover that region, and they may do a biodiversity survey which uses 2 data sets or 3 data sets which have 3 DOIs and up to a couple million entities in each one. But those entities themselves, that image themselves that's citing, do we need to record that it's an image, it's associated with this collection, and it is found here, and that record needs to be persistent forevermore, even if it goes brittle temporarily when those data get hived off onto tape, because one of the big things we're having to look at in the account is net zero, which means we're going to be putting these types of data onto spinning disk, which means they're rapidly accessible, but after 12 months or 3 years depending on the project, they're going to get put onto tape, so they get a slower access. So that record will become temporarily brittle in 2 or 3 years' time, but it will still be recoverable on a longer timescale.
Well, at least for biological imaging, so in general, the sort of the standardization effort is sort of right now happening, and because it's not really a solved problem. Well, to me, this sounds like sort of a community, well, specifically imaging. It sounds like a community-specific standardization problem, which is, yeah, I think it's a good point. How would the community-based standards sort of interact with the sort of reliquary concepts?
Imaging is one example. I've got more, but they've all got a similar thing. Passive acoustic data is another thing that's going to start generating 6 terabytes per couple of week glider deployment soon. So they've all got a similar theme to them, and it's what is that minimum viable product that enables us to serve all of those communities, and what is that minimum metadata spec that we need on top of those entities to make it work? Because if we don't get that right, I think we might be setting ourselves up with a problem.
I mean, what is in the chat window, which is what Web of Science, I think, is doing about what are the minimal metadata for citation. I think that's not so crazy and also fairly stable. The only thing that was added, I don't see here, is version. And what is also common is content type, so that the citation says this is a data set and not an article. But I don't see that there is a sort of never-ending discussion of what else metadata needed for a citation. So I think that's a good starting point, that there's, I mean, it's still a lot of stuff if you have 10,000 data sets, but at least it's fairly stable, and also they're sort of expressed in many vocabularies.
A lot of those are inherited by parent metadata as well, so you can actually inherit them, which makes it easy.
I could imagine a tool that, you know, if you had the URL, it could pull the metadata that you need from the existing source to build out. So yeah, this was from my conversation with Megan Force. She's really rooting for us, by the way.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, there's of course the whole now old story about embedding schema.org in landing pages of data repositories, which Google Dataset Search uses, which I think has a lot of uptake, but it's still not commonplace.
Not yet.
But I think that's one big element in this, because then sort of you can scale this sort of meta distribution in other ways. That would just be up, please scrape our webs or repository, assuming we're talking about public data, which probably true most of the time, but of course there are also sensitive data and other things.
And there's a couple ways to, so when publishers think about citation, what they tell the author is one thing, and how they handle it behind the scenes is another thing. So we're kind of at this point behind the scenes. What do we need minimally to actually make a viable connection? And then what would we tell the community to try to get the best possible connection, but still we'd allow flexibility. So I think we need to think about it like that. And then, you know, whoever's implementing this gets the opportunity to tune it to their community. But the base content should be the same / similar, so that we get adoption to happen.
Is the concept of a landing page for data set old-fashioned, or is that still something we all assume is sort of one of the basics for exposing metadata, for example?
I think it's still there. I think that's only because Mark Parsons stopped talking about something else. I think we're still good on landing pages.
But if we think about that, an object definition in a reliquary at a minimum should, and we might say must, have enough information to enable site identification of that object. And ideally, citation of that object.
Yeah, I think this is very close to each other. So I mean, the minimal is maybe just a unique identifier, but if you have a few things about an object that describes it, you might as well have everything that describes it, because it's, yeah, that's the direction you're going anyway. Like, who's the author, when was this published, where, title. I mean, that's the basic stuff you want to know when you think about something.
Right. And when I think about the indexers, if we make the job too difficult, where they have to look at the DOI of the reliquary and then the PID of the object inside the reliquary, and then take that and go to somewhere else to then formulate what was cited, you're not going to have any counts, at least not in the next 10 years. Yeah. And so I think that idea of having enough there that you could formulate the citation and count it as a citation and identify that object. That is what we're looking for. It's not a, you couldn't put any other objects in there, but don't count on that they're ever counted individually.
Could I interject just, I see Chris put his hand up, but just for just 1 second. So conversations that we've had with Crossref and with Martin previously, gosh, couldn't a journal just give us the DOI and then all of the resolving mechanisms behind the scenes could just fill in the rest of the citation within the reference section of a paper? Yes, they could. But what has happened in the past is that one number is wrong, but it's still a good DOI, and you just cited the wrong thing. This actually, it was a significant problem within journal communities, so they don't do that, and they don't trust just the PID. They want you to give the title, et cetera, so that there is a way to validate that that PID was correct. So we will have the same problem here. And so how we generate, like when, I'm looking at Stan and he's nodding his head, but that mechanism for generating the list needs to account for the fact that typos could happen.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
that's a good way to verify it, right? And maybe you start with just the PIDs, but then you kind of fatten it out to have also here all the titles or whatever. And you would easily see if there's suddenly it's talking about butterflies when you thought you were talking about, I don't know, aluminum samples or something, right?
Yeah,
and that's important also because the PIDs, even though there has a P in there, at some point are going to stop working, right? And then you have at least like the classical, like those PDFs I sent you, it just says Darwin 1869 or whatever, but we can still kind of with a bit of work figure out what that means, right? If it had only a number, you're probably at loss.
Okay, so Chris. Chris, you're going to have to unmute. Yeah.
I know. I just I don't know if Justin, he's had his hand up too, so I don't know if Justin had something to say. But I was thinking, I know Debbie, you're going to kill me because I was talking about scope before. And I just always think about the user. I can't help it. I've worked in libraries for so long. And I just came off of an NIH project, and I'm also working on an ML, machine learning project, and knowing how those communities sort of put things up on websites, and like, for instance, in the NIH community, they're just like, here's our study, here's a website, and they're working on the underlying data, and they say it's fair. And I don't know about the machine learning people, currently there's something there to be said that they're not using DOIs, they're not using this system for minting this basic, container, this citation that we're talking about. And I think we're in that space right now where we're thinking about the big examples, right? Like the big examples are often in that machine learning area, and like the big surveys and these big data sets, and they just use websites, they post things in buckets, and so I know we kind of shoehorn ourselves into the citation and think about it that way, but like, this is how people are working right now. It's easy for them, and I think like we gotta think about how this is easy for them to, like, to generate something, that is citable, because it's a big problem, like no one has addressed this yet.
So I think for the moment, we're not talking about solving it. We're talking about enabling that you could have put URLs in this reliquary as objects. So James.
Sorry. Yeah, it was just on this of wanting the title for the PID. It's just from experience of trying to get people to have a DOI, it's been quite onerous at times to get people to buy in. Now they're buying in, it's actually quite easy. But in terms of this title, to then, if we're saying we're wanting something brittle, and then you're saying you're wanting a title, you can't really have a title on the www. And if you have 10,000, 100,000 things, someone's not going to fill that in. So
but it's fairly easy for something to try and get the title for each of them. A software program can do that.
So yeah, so it
So
could
there's
be
two. We're talking about two levels of reliquaries here, aren't we?
Yeah. So effectively, yeah. So we're having a mandatory element and then an optional thing that could be machine filled back, back populated or something, or updated.
Maybe we have to think about reliquaries as output of, say, a machine learning thing, right? Which they might have not been able to fill in all these blanks, right? Because they don't have PID resolution and all these kind of things. And then we have reliquaries which are ready to be cited, right? They have been polished. Maybe it should be very little you have to polish. It should be like fill in your author name, that kind of thing, and maybe run through something that checks that the PIDs actually work, something like that. And that could fill in the title, right? So there's 1 or 2 levels of conformance to be a reliquary. The first one might just be a flat text file, but there's no reason why they couldn't just be the same, just thin and thick in a sense.
So it's effectively the two different stage, the growing stage of we have, yeah.
One thing I find is that if we were to make something that where if you'd done the proper identification, it turned into proper citations and counts and all of those pieces, that's going to turn into a carrot for people to give that additional information because they're going to be able to get more data. They're going to be able to get more of these things because people are recognizing that when they do this, they get citations. And so I find that we don't want to be we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. We want it to be good enough that the carrot it turns into a carrot. That there's enough that we're able to do it right. That in fact, people see how much better that was than any other way they had, and therefore they start wanting to be able to do it that well.
And a tool I really like that can help here. I mean, all reference managers do this, but Zotero has invested a lot of effort in this. And there's also, it's fairly easy to have a support for a specific repository. So I basically go to the repository page, and then Zotero figures out how to get the metadata from the URL, and that just enables citation for the researcher. I mean, that's different from running a data repository. And I really like the idea that if somebody uses URLs, we should be able to support them in some way. And there's a lot of stuff you can gather if there's metadata and so forth on that URL page, if it's a landing page. I have no idea what Zotero would do with your 10,000 reliquary data sets. Maybe that's not the scale it likes to operate on, but that's something to explore.
Okay, so I want to do a little bit of logistics here. Shelley had mentioned that we were going to try and end at 2 hours in, and I guess I'd like to know who needs to end by the top of the hour. Okay, Justin, Yugi, Stian would like to. Martin would. Okay, so we now have 24 minutes left. So I want to move us along a little bit. And I think that reality is we've got enough consensus that it does feel like we could potentially have a few teams of people or individuals who say, okay, I want to go off and sort of flesh out what I think could work as the solution. And so I think we're not horribly far from being able to sort of get ready for the next meeting. But I think there are a couple topics that we haven't hit. I think, so one would be authorship of the reliquary itself. seems like there's sort of two existing strategies out there. There's three. Of what I've seen of all the methods, there's the people who put the reliquary together are the authors of the reliquary. I've seen all of the authors of the works within the reliquary as the authorship. And the third as there are no authors. In fact, the individual items speak for themselves. Do you all have thoughts about this for a reliquary?
Well, one thought I have is I don't think authorship is a strict requirement for data sets. It's often not appropriate.
Yes, in some cases here we're talking about software making them, but I don't say they're not author, it's just the author is not a person.
Okay, but it is sort of credit business. If you want to collect credit for your sequencing machines or sensors in the ocean, yes, but
sometimes they do, yeah, because they cost a lot of money, right? I want to know.
Okay, no, that's true, but sort of, for me, it's a slightly different thing. But
isn't it, Martin, that we've kind of defaulted to project in the case of author, like that for software?
Oh, I don't know. I think there's a gray area. Software might actually be easier because that's mostly written by humans, but for collecting data in automated ways, I'm not sure what the various places do with authorship.
You need an author. Could you opt to have a creator as the primary person assigned to it, so you know where it's come from, but they don't necessarily get credit for the contents?
Yeah, in the data side world, creator, or also in the Dublin core world, creator is sort of an alias of author. So it's the same thing also in schema.org. Creator and author are sort of used interchangeably there. So I'm sure you can always put in something, but I don't know how valuable the information is then.
Yeah, I guess I think of there's some cases where the person putting together the reliquary is sort of the editor, right? Like the editor of a collection. And so I think there is a potential need for that, particularly if we allow that they can put context of why are these things in there, because then they're actually adding research content to this particular element. All right, so I don't want to drive it too far. I want to bring that up as one of the topics we have to think about. I want to also keep us in mind of the licensing on those individual items, because in the past, a large number of cases where I've seen people put together collections of data sets in some way, dynamic data citation or other ways, the licensing of the individual elements has been uniform. And so it's not difficult to put those things together. We want to think about whether there's any licensing implications of putting things of different licensing into a reliquary and what needs to be done to address that, if anything.
Well, I think we have a license issue with some of the licenses. So in CMIP, so our large climate project, we initially decided to have a share alike license. And that would mean that every product, and including the reliquary, would need to have the same license. So we are running in a lot of problems with that and have a special exemption for the IPCC now from all the modeling centers. So there might be some licenses with problems here.
If you're not actually using or moving the data, do you have to, what licensing would you have to have? Do you have to have licensing if you're just saying these are the things that I used?
It depends where you're allowed to use them in the first place, but that's a different matter though, isn't it?
You're not saying that you necessarily.
Let's assume the creator of the reliquary is in charge of making sure that everything that's in the reliquaries via metadata they're allowed to use that metadata at a minimum and cite that thing. But
there could
I
be
just
things
want to
that
bring
are,
it
when
up
you're
because
talking about cultural heritage, things that are, you have recordings of people and so on, even though, yeah, you should have to attribute them by name and so on. Now suddenly you're propagating personal identifiable information, which there might be restrictions on you on how you are allowed to do that or not. And so there might be conditions of use of that aggregated metadata you have made just because for where it came from.
Shelley.
I don't think license we talk about transitive properties, like if you cite the reliquary, you then give credit to all the elements. I don't think licensing can work like that. I think the reliquary can't provide the license. I think you have to redirect to the elements. And then the problem
it should have a license on its own metadata, right? Or its own data, right? Hopefully an open one.
Yeah, actually, you're right. You're right. So we would have to be really clear that the license for the reliquary is not speaking for the elements. But then the problem still stands for any researcher. Did you have appropriate permissions to use those elements? That doesn't change. You still have to validate that in the way you would have had you cited all 100 plus. Anyway,
if you start embedding the metadata, that might come with its own metadata license, which is not necessarily exactly the same one you have for the whole. So hopefully they are compatible, but still it might just require that you list that license and so on. So we had faced that where because you're building from one to the other, now say something is CC by, then you have to attribute them. And we know these are horrible, but it is going to happen. People do put metadata under this license, in which case you cannot remove the author name, for instance, right?
Thank you for that. I think you may have just given me my very first use case where I now understand why the metadata for FAIR was supposed to have its own DOI. I think I finally get that now. It's only been 6 years. Okay.
Shelley, sorry.
Carolyn, you wanted to say something?
So going back to licensing, there are two. I'm envisioning a branch with two forks. Either the reliquary was put together by a person, by a researcher, grabbing data sets that the researcher found relevant and wanting to cite them as a collection, unbeknownst to the authors or the creators of the individual data sets. The other branch is a reliquary is developed with the cooperation of everyone, including the creators of the data sets, sort of submitting to, if you will,
I think she hit leave instead of. Wait. She's coming back.
Caroline?
She's got us on the edge of our seats.
Oh.
Caroline,
what did you hear last? Okay. So let me go back. So use case number one is the researcher putting together a reliquary of data sets unbeknownst to the creator of the data sets. So, hey, this looks good. You've got that. But then the other one is where the data set creators are in on the creation of the reliquary. You have someone either who puts a call out or contacts the researchers that developed the data sets and say, hey,
I really like what you're doing. I'd like to put together this either permanent or immutable collection of these data sets, because they look like they fit together well, or they're being cited together quite often. And so going back to the idea of rights, of permissions, I think those are two very different cases, and I think they should be addressed separately. That's it.
But while I don't disagree, I think the default case for me is close enough to licenses for bibliometrics. So we just take open citations where it's close enough to data that I feel comfortable saying these are facts, and they might not even be copyrightable, but if anything, that's a CC0 or similar, because it might be tough to make a decision which of the two scenarios that, Carol, that you described is sort of the case, and it's probably a very sort of fluid boundary. But sharing reliquaries as a list of things with PIDs and some metadata, I think the copyright or the license hurdle should be pretty low, let's put it like this.
Okay, so I'm gonna take control again, since we're getting toward we got 12 more minutes left. So I'm gonna share my presentation again, because I guess what I'd really like to do, actually I'm not going to share it yet. What we in confabbing yesterday with Shelley and Carolyn and Chris. What we came up with that might make sense as the next step is for ideally some number of us would have some idea of what they think is the answer and would put together a demonstration of what that looks like. You know, how that'd work, what does a reliquary look like, what are the objects in it look like, you know, how would this all work? Where would these be hosted, and a proposal of what this thing looks like, and where we ideally have a few of those, and that we would put forward a set of evaluation criteria that should be used in thinking about whether or not this meets the criteria. Most of them will probably have some gaps, but where we're able to then in the next meeting look at these and say, okay, this feels like the right approach forward, where it's maybe a combination of different things people put together, or maybe it's one of the particular solutions. And the other piece to make this easier to sort of be able to compare apples and apples instead of apples and oranges, would be to have a couple of use cases that we would try to have each of these prototypes sort of show what it'd look like in theirs. And so what we were thinking is maybe if the GBIF folks were willing to put together a use case where, you know, one of the bio teams would put together a use case that sort of looks at a bio example, where maybe if Martina, if you were willing to put together sort of what would be a use case for the IPCC data, and I'd be willing to put together one that maybe would use Ameriflux or one of the projects that I curate large data sets for, such that the different proposed solutions could then show what would this look like in our solution. So are people, is there anyone interested in doing that or willing to do that? Okay, so Justin's volunteered.
On it as well.
Okay. And are you volunteering to to describe a use case or to actually put forward a prototype solution?
A use case with a conceptual solution on top of it for what we do as a data center.
Okay. And it would be very helpful if you make a use case and then separately, you know, the conceptual solution, so that if there are other people who are volunteering to do these, that we could, they could also look at that use case and try to see how it would look in their system.
So kind of a pair of schematics, effectively.
Effectively, yeah.
Cool.
Anyone else willing to try to put together something?
I can put together a use case as well. I don't know if I go that route as Justin, to have one suggestion for a solution, or just leave it with the use case. I might need a bit longer maybe to just get back to our technical support unit who puts it together, just to take care that I really capture the right use case.
Okay. Anyone else who's willing to volunteer to try to put together a prototype?
Those are your two repository owners. You got all the folks you can. And then you, Deb.
We already have a collection type in our workflow hub, so we could always experiment with things there.
Yeah. We could tag you, Uwe, who, I mean, if Pangea already has something on the dot or close. Actually, didn't he give us like 5 different variations on his? So I
yes,
think
yes, he did.
Yeah, let's tag Uwe, and let's make sure Carol has an action item, because I don't want her. Yeah, I'm kidding.
I don't want to sort of lean too far out of the window, but well, in a few weeks I will start working on Invenio RDM, and of course one task is to build things that Zenodo Invenio RDM doesn't do yet. I will initially work on data citation. There is some recommendation that somebody wrote a few years ago, but the idea to sort of experiment with something, I think that I would be in a position to do something, which is, if it's sort of something is in Zenodo, but we want to try to do it slightly differently or something. I mean, it depends on timelines, etc. And I hope it's not monstrous, but I would be in a situation to do some of these things we are sort of thinking
I
about.
thought we had already tricked you into adding our create support in Zenodo.
Yeah.
Well, I do think there's a really important role for a general repository, Zenodo or someone, to help the researcher who is trying to do this with a repository that doesn't support a collection, or is trying to combine, as UGIS has done, across repositories. And so I do think that is needed. So even if you're not in a position to do that today, that would be a great thought.
Yeah, if we're talking at some point before the end of the year, that's very realistic. If we're talking about, oh, do something next week, not so much. But also maybe there have to be a little bit more concrete ideas, because many pieces are already there. We said we want to start what exists. But if there's sort of a specific gap, because for me, it's sort of straightforward enough to just set up a playground of something which you don't want to do with necessarily with Pangea, which is sort of nice and working, and tweak things too much to see where this can go.
So biostudies could be, in principle, quite easily used for sort of prototyping things. So I could also offer to help.
Okay.
But it's similar to Martin. The next few weeks perhaps not feasible.
And maybe we can even think about doing things in similar ways, because we have, I mean, we have said we have some basic ideas that are the same, and then you can implement this in various ways, and of course, ideally based on existing infrastructure.
Yeah. I mean, the idea here is that we don't have one answer. We have many answers, but the mechanisms have some commonality, such that when a journal cites a reliquary, it looks the same what we tell them is the same, and an indexer or the way we count citations on the other side looks the same. So that's the general idea. But the front end, the argument that Caroline and Chris have been making about making this easy for a researcher, it has to be just as flexible as they are.
So how about in putting together the notes for this meeting, I noticed that we've been meeting on the 8th of a month every time. So we're already looking at September 8th as maybe the next meeting. What I was thinking is, if we could get the use cases together, say in the next 2 to 3 weeks, that would sort of give everybody the use cases that that we have. I think that's a diverse enough set of use cases that we would have a reasonable cross section of things that could need reliquaries. And then maybe, and then I don't know whether people would be able to commit to having something done by September 8th, but I think even just meeting to sort of talk about where everybody's at might be useful on the 8th of September. And it would keep us with the symmetry of 8s, which I'm really enjoying.
I have to run, unfortunately, for another call, but this was, again, very enjoyable. So I look forward to look at the notes again, but also the next call on the 8th, whatever 8th that is.
I think you all got an invitation for September 8th. We don't quite have the time yet, but I think we blocked a few hours. So is anyone not available that we should be aware of and mess with Deb's dream of the 8ths? Okay, all right, we'll go with it.
All right, thanks everybody. This has been fantastic. We've made a lot of progress. I'm really happy about this. All right.
Bye, thanks.
Bye-bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Good to talk to you.